the Taliban delegation in Islamabad, and they gave them a red carpet protocol. So
Mhm.
these two actions, on a single day, it very clearly defines uh, the policy and the structure of Pakistani state. It's very much clear that whoever is opposing war, someone like Ali Wazir, who is
Mhm.
very harsh, who is very blunt against these war policies of Pakistani state, who has been a victim of the war, who has lost almost all the male members of his family in this so-called war against terror. And when he talk against the war, and when he condemns the war policies of Pakistani state, he is being prosecuted. He has been uh, dragged. He's been handcuffed and presented in court like criminals. And it's not for the first time. Everybody knows that when more than a year ago, an incident occurred in the remote area of North Waziristan. Both me and he were imprisoned, and we were kept in the cell which were made for militants.
Mhm.
So they are repeating, the same action again and again. So whoever speaks for human rights, whoever speaks for peace, he will be treated like the way Ali Wazir has been. And on the other side, if someone is, a jet black terrorist who has been involved in the murders and killings of thousands of people, they are treated otherwise. So it's very clearly, the Pakistani state is very clearly defining itself.
Mm. Dawar Saib, you're saying the Pakistani state, not the government. When you say the Pakistani state, isn't it represented by the government of PM Imran Khan? Or is it someone else behind all this mayhem?
Well, the entire world knows that who actually runs the state affairs
Mm.
in Kenya. Even the former Secretary of State of the U.S., Hillary Clinton, she also, very simply defined what actually the deep state means. So,
Mhm.
actually the state affairs in Pakistan, which has been run by the military and its intelligence agencies, and the 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 actual government, the de jure government, they have hardly to do anything with foreign policies, specifically with um, war and terror and all these things.
Mhm.
So it's the military who formulates these policies, and it's the military who so-called implements it. It has been, the same from the era of the Cold War, and after that we have been witnessed that they were in the one who were in the control of the entire policy. Even after 9/11, which when it started in the second phase on the name of the war against terror. So by the state I means that there might be some sort of consent in many times by the civilian governments also, but it is actually the Pakistani military and the intelligence agencies uh, who runs the state affairs in Pakistan.
Okay, can I go on with one more question and then we'll go to Professor Mali? What is the interest of the state in crushing the human rights activists and supporting those who are known killers, who are known violators of laws of the country as well as international laws?
Well, I think the strategic interests
Yeah.
of the Pakistan military, it it doesn't suit them to create an environment of a peaceful and
Mm-hmm.
social welfare state, because they have these Pakistani generals, they have earned billions during these wars, so war will always benefit them. So they always try to create an environment like a war. and that is something which rattles them the most, because PTM is, you know, a very at this time PTM is the biggest hurdle uh, between their policies, and we are not allowing, and we have been opposing it, and we have been criticizing it, and by using the mass power, PTM has, you know, almost from the last 2.5 in 3 years, it has put these policies on back foot. It has put the state of Pakistan on back foot. So otherwise, I think the situation, if there would have been no PTM, the situation would have been a bit more different. The entire Pashtunkhwa, all the ex-FATA, in specifically in Pashtunkhwa, would have been militarized long ago. They are still, you know, trying to regroup these militants and use this Pashtun belt as a backyard for their strategic interests in Afghanistan. And specifically in the next phase, which is during the Afghan peace, which is supposed to be coming in future. So I think they still want to impose another proxy government in Afghanistan, and for that purpose, they will use the entire Pashtun belt across the Dunan as a backyard. But PTM is still now the biggest hurdle in their policies, and we will keep opposing it, and we will not let it happen again.
Thank you so much. Professor Mawla, I'll come to you. Obviously, you have your own input, but I'd also like you, once you're done with whatever you have to say, if you could tackle two questions. Number one, the foreign policy of Pakistan vis-a-vis its neighbors, particularly Afghanistan, and then also how this affects the peace in the region. Thank you so much. Please go on.
Thanks, Malays, and I'll address both of those questions in a way woven into the remarks that I'm about to make. I think I agree with everything that Mr. Mohsin Dawa has offered in his presentation, and I think in a way the situation in Pakistan at the moment is much more alarming than the perceptions in most Western capitals would lead one to think. And for that reason, this particular seminar is very opportune in its timing, and hopefully some of the messages that will surface today will find their way into Western capitals as well. If one looks at the Pakistan state, one of the things that I think is striking is that for decades, it's been what the American scholar Thomas Thornton called as an insecurity state, in which a strategic culture has developed within the military, which is driven by a sense of insecurity, which then can lead the military to adopt positions which are objectively not in the interests of Pakistan or its population, but which were a product of this Weltanschauung, which has been very deeply rooted in the thinking of the established Pakistan in 1971, was an obviously critical factor which shaped the views of the world that a whole generation of officers within the Pakistani military entertained. And when you have a strategic culture that has taken root within an organization such as a military, which is then transmitted intergenerationally through training programs within military establishments and things like that, it's a much trickier problem to deal with than when one simply sees people apparently acting against their interests. It's not a problem which is necessarily amenable to solution by mechanisms of persuasion, because the more persuasive your arguments are that the military should change course, the more people will respond that you're just part of the conspiracy to do them down, and that the insecurity that they see as looming from all directions would confront them even more seriously. And of course, India is central to this particular image, although ever since the 1998 nuclear tests, Pakistan has had a very strong protection against the existential threat of an Indian invasion, combined with the fact that India is not interested in absorbing Pakistan into its territory for obvious reasons. This has actually given rise to a situation in which two problems have manifested themselves and then accumulated over time. One is the weakness of the upper echelons of the civilian political elite. When you have regular military interventions in politics, as happened since the 1950s in Pakistan, at a certain point, it begins to affect the civilian establishment as well, because politicians of the older variety tend to expect that they will be tipped out at a certain phase, and that can then give rise to patterns of behavior which are really focused on self-enrichment rather than on the wider good of the society. This, I think, is one reason why the PTM is seen as so threatening to the military in Pakistan, because it's a younger movement which is much more values-oriented. A recent scholarly article has suggested that it's offering a very serious challenge because it's a manifestation of societal demands for accountability rather than just nominal demands for accountability from a political elite that has proved in the past that it can be bought off in different ways, in the way in which Imran Khan has been bought off by being given the office of Prime Minister, even though real power resides with the military still. So that's one side of the problem. The other side of the problem is that the military has over time become more and more attuned to the use of surrogates as a device for pursuing disruptive strategies in neighbouring states, and it goes back. Obviously, it's manifested itself in Kashmir, but also in Afghanistan. And in a way, I think one can see what's going on in Afghanistan at the moment as a kind of creeping invasion run out of Rawalpindi, in which the Afghan Taliban are presented as the authentic representatives of the Pashtuns of Afghanistan, which of course they're not, and that this is then used as a device to try to legitimate their return to power. And one of the saddest things about the current environment is that the United States, simply interested in exiting Afghanistan, has bought this particular line, hook, line and sinker, and that's having very destructive implications for Afghanistan, but I think for Pakistan as well. Just to elaborate on that very briefly, the disposition to support radical Islamists in Afghanistan, particularly the Hezb-e Islami of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar in the early to mid to late 1980s, had a great deal to do with partly the orientation of General Zia himself, but also to do with the longer history of relations between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and particularly the Pashtunistan dispute. And in Rawalpindi, there was a sense that it was unwise in the 1980s to support more secularized nationalist groups in Afghanistan because they might be more likely in the future to revive a territorial claim, whereas groups such as the Hezb-e Islami, which had been a pretty loyal client of ISI from 1973 onwards, were unlikely to do this kind of thing. And that then led to a disposition within ISI in the 80s to lend support to groups that had weak popularity on the ground in Afghanistan and therefore were more dependent upon the patronage of ISI to achieve any objectives to which they were committed. But the long-term consequences for Afghanistan of that have been extremely severe, because after 1992, the Hezb-e Islami, which was very unpopular, proved incapable of holding and securing territory and, in a sense, Pakistan's interests in Afghanistan. And that then led General Babar to switch support to the Taliban, which he used routinely to describe as our boys, in a way which infuriated the foreign ministry in Pakistan, because it was trying at the same time to run a propaganda line that this was an autonomous movement that had emerged rather than something that had been instrumentalized by the military. Now, this then becomes part of a wider disposition which we can see playing out at the moment within Pakistan, which is for the military to act surreptitiously and to deny all the time what they're doing. And this is something which Western governments have typically found very difficult to handle because they don't have in diplomacy the kind of language and vocabulary you need to say that somebody is lying shamelessly. And this became, in a sense, clear from the memoirs of George Shultz, the US Secretary of State from 1982 to 1989, who recorded the details of a phone conversation in 1988 between General Zia and President Reagan after the Geneva Accords on Afghanistan had been signed. And Reagan somewhat ingenuously asked Zia how he was going to manage continued support for the Afghan Mujahideen parties, even though he'd committed in the Geneva Accords to cut it off. And Zia's response, recorded by Shultz, was, "We'll just lie about it. We've been lying for years about what we're doing in Afghanistan." And I think that, in a sense, is a window into the modus operandi of the military, that they see misrepresentation of reality as a strategic tool that can be used to advance their political interest, whether what they're doing is meddling in Afghanistan or Kashmir, or using the military as a device to try to repress societal movements within Pakistan itself. And it's in this context that attacks on journalists within Pakistan begin to make a lot more sense, because if you are going to spin a particular narrative that is remote from the truth, what you don't want is autonomous and independent movements in place that are going to challenge the lines of argument that you're trying to market both domestically and to a wider world. And that's one of the senses in which PTM is also seen as a very serious threat, because it has traction within society, because it's seen as being a values-based movement rather than something that's simply advancing the vested interests of particular participants in the movement. That means, I think, that we're looking at a very dangerous situation at the moment. I think I agree entirely with Mohsin Dawar about what the objectives in Afghanistan are likely to be. The peace process based in Doha is actually a farce. It's an exit process as far as the United States is concerned. The Afghan Taliban have already been given by the Americans all that they want in the process, and they're now engaging in strategic stalling simply to ensure that American troops are gone, come what may, by the 1st of May, which will then open the door for them to push their way through to Kabul, claiming to act as representatives of the largest group within Afghanistan, but primed to repress modernist voices from within Pashtun and other communities in Afghanistan when they are raised against the kind of policies that the Taliban advanced in the 1990s, in which I think there's every prospect they would try to give effect again if they came to power. So in that sense, I think the struggle that's being prosecuted by the PTM in Pakistan at the moment is actually a global struggle. The kinds of the rights of repressed minorities, the rights of people who are supporting a more liberal approach to society, are actually human rights which we all share. And in that sense, solidarity with those who are facing repression at the moment is actually very important. So let me conclude on that point, and I'm very happy to continue elements of discussion.
Thank you so much. Before I pose a couple of questions that I have, I'd like to tell my audience that they can pose their questions in the comment section. Also, in our from our Facebook page, we are live right now with MP Mohsin Dawar and Professor Mali, and they can also ask the questions, and we'll pose them to our audiences. Mr. Dawar, you have the opportunity to, if you have any comments to Mr. Mali's input. If not, I'd like to now move from diagnosis, which was we know what the problem is, to solutions. How Pakistan is getting away with all this? How can we create internal pressures such as PTM as well as international pressures now to make sure Pakistan does not get away with this?
Well, I think Pakistan has always been working, and it has been helping some of the Western interests of the some Western countries. And I think it has been doing the same job right now also. If you talk about the Afghan peace process, it is, I personally call it U.S. withdrawal process, because as just, like Professor Molle says that, just like he said that the U.S. has given Taliban all what they have wanted. Something which we haven't yet seen is the peace. All these dialogue in Doha, it started with the name of the peace, and we have yet to see any peace happening in Afghanistan. Forget about the peace. We haven't even seen the process even just starting. So it's just, I don't know what's going to happen when the regime changes. But till now, what we have seen is it's just a preparation for the withdrawal of the US, and nothing about the peace in Afghanistan have been seen. Well, the role of Pakistan over the years, since the creation of Pakistan, it has almost worked as a colony of the West, be it the veto or the center policies, the way they facilitated the US, and be it the Cold War era, the way this Pakistan army, the way the Pakistani generals fought for the US. And again, now what we are sensing is that there seems to be another proxy war happening in this region, because China they're trying to encroach, and they are working on one belt, one road, and US is, I think, they're not happy with that, and this was one of the biggest reason the former Prime Minister of Pakistan, Mian Nawaz Sharif, it was one of the biggest reasons he faced a lot of the Western powers, because he was more interested in stretching and engaging with the China in building this CPEC and One Belt, One Road and all these things, which US was not happy with. So then, what happened is that the regime changed. Instead, that the Nawaz Sharif still, he was enjoying a popularity. He carried, if there would have been a fair election in Pakistan, I think Nawaz Sharif would have been the prime minister. But all these international and local establishments, and they install their own people, and they are following the same instruction. Now, currently, everything might be okay, but in the future, it will be a very critical situation for Pakistan, because they have to choose either CPEC or they have to work accordingly with the US interests, which they have been doing since last 72 years. But now, the way they have engaged with the China, and the way the Chinese have invested in the CPEC, rolling back all these exercise is also not an easy job. So the situation is once again very much critical for Pakistan. They have to choose one way, and whatever way they choose, undermining the other won't be very much easy for Pakistan. So if we talk about the way out, I think as long as the Pakistani state and its military is involved in these kind of strategic wars, I think I don't see any way out and any positive thing happening in the region, unless they bring an absolute change in their policy, and unless they started behaving like they started working like a responsible state. I don't think so that there is other way out which can bring something positive in the region.
You're pointing to a very interesting issue here, a new dynamic, which is the influence of China. Professor Mali, what do you think? Is the waning power of or influence of the West going to be another hit on the nonviolent movement such as PTM? Or is Pakistan still mindful of what the West is telling them?
Pakistan is still mindful of Western positions. And for example, although some have argued that there's no point in pressuring the military in Pakistan because it will simply drive the establishment into the arms of the Chinese, it's not the case that China can offer everything that Western countries can offer. It's still the case that General Sons would rather study at Harvard or Yale than at the University of Peking. And so there are elements of Western incentive structures that can be put in place which are relevant there. Where I think
can I interject here? Can I interject here quickly? Like there are these suggestions that certain individuals within the army and their families should be banned from the Western states. They should be banned. Their travels, their accounts should be frozen. Are you suggesting something similar could coerce the Pakistani state into looking at this from a very different angle?
Well, it's not the kind of thing that would necessarily change the orientation of the Pakistan state immediately, but selective sanctioning of that sort sends a signal. And that is the objective of that kind of exercise, to make the point that there are consequences that flow from particular actions being taken, and it's certainly worth bearing that kind of thing, that kind of option in mind. There was actually a strong paper written by Lisa Curtis and Hussein Haqqani a couple of years ago for the Heritage Foundation in the United States, which set out a whole range of measures which potentially could be taken to send signals to the military in Pakistan that it was not okay to act in the way in which the military had been acting. Now, part of the problem over a long period of time is that the military had fed into Western circles a very successful narrative to the effect that if you put pressure on us, then you will precipitate an internal collapse within Pakistan, and the result will be the emergence of a fundamentalist regime with access to nuclear weapons. Now, I don't think that this was remotely likely if the kind of measures that, say, Haqqani and Curtis had been talking about came to be applied, but it was enough to scare Western politicians away from addressing problems with the orientation of the Pakistani establishment that simply compounded over time. We've got a worse problem now than we had 15 years ago. And if you look at the question of when has Pakistan actually behaved through its military in particular in a constructive fashion, you have to go back to when the Americans issued very tough threats in the immediate aftermath of 2001 in a way that was credible. Part of the problem then was that President Bush decided that President Musharraf was a buddy, and that the pressure came off and the Americans became distracted by their involvement in Iraq, and that opened the door for Rawalpindi to go back to the strategy of arming the Taliban from about 2003 onwards and reconstituting them as a tool that could be used within the internal politics of Pakistan. And the Americans, who by this stage were moving a lot of equipment through Pakistani territory, started wringing their hands and essentially went down the path of pretending that if they kept lines of communication open to the military was going to begin to behave itself, which was wishful thinking of the dreamiest possible variety. And in a sense, we've worked our way over quite a number of years into a position where the Western approach to Pakistan is substantially built on dreams, on the belief that constructive engagement with the military is going to produce what one wants to see. Whereas, in fact, the signal that attempts at constructive engagement has sent is one that, to the effect that Rawalpindi is dealing with supine international actors who are never going to blow the whistle on what is actually being done. And that then becomes highly problematic, not just in terms of the regional politics, but also in terms of giving a kind of green light to the military within Pakistan to do whatever it likes to groups that may be mobilizing to demand higher levels of accountability or human rights or whatever. The moment you start thinking of generals as our boys or something like that, then you're in big trouble.
Well, the problem is, I mean, what we've seen from Mohsen Dawar's arrest in the past, and also from the arrest of MP Ali Wazir right now, in the Western capitals, we see no one of note taking this seriously and asking Pakistan for answers. Right now, MP Ali Wazir is in a place, in an unknown place, and no one is taking this seriously. So how can we change that? What will it take to bring about this kind of change?
Look, to be realistic, I don't think it's something which is going to change overnight. And part of the problem is that in major Western capitals, there's just a vast range of challenges that are crowding in from all directions at the moment. And that means that issues in any one country will struggle to obtain attention from major policy circles. And that's just an existential reality. I think the answer to that is to be found in a comment that was made by an MP in Australia 45 years ago, somebody I knew, when Mao Zedong had died in Beijing. And there was a motion of condolence moved in the Australian House of Representatives following Mao's death, and it was supported by all the major political parties. And then this acquaintance of mine stood up and denounced Mao Zedong as a murderer who had killed vast numbers of his own people over a very long period of time. And his concluding words, which I can remember to this day, were, in the wider world, my voice amounts for little, but if one man cannot speak, what hope is there for any man? And I think in a sense, there are responsibilities that individuals carry, powerful, powerless, whatever, to adopt moral stances in respect of these kinds of challenges, to speak out whenever the opportunity presents itself. Now, I'm not saying that's a solution. In a way, it's a kind of Weberian ethic of responsibility that comes into play. Here I stand, I can do no other. And I think encouraging that kind of voice is important under these circumstances, but I do think it's a very challenging time in terms of promoting sensitivity to the kinds of threats that civil society groups are facing in many different parts of the world. I don't think there's any way of gilding the lily in this respect.
Dawarsaeb, if I can come back to you, how have you sustained such a massive movement for a period of almost three years now? And how do you see the future of your movement in the face of all these challenges and extreme suppression that we are facing?
Well, the basic reason that PTM has sustained for almost 3 years is that because the miseries which led the people, which forced the people towards this movement are still the same. Initially, there was, a lot of frustration, which was, building over the years, starting from 9/11, and when we saw, these militants coming from different areas of the world, or specifically Afghanistan, then they were residing in Waziristan, and we have witnessed that brutalities, and after that we have seen military operations, and the last stage, after post-military operations, which was the last hope for the people of that area, that we might see some kind of relief, but even that stage was worse than what they have seen in the past, because even after the military operations, they have seen some extreme level of torture and humiliation from the Pakistani military. So all these things, they built the frustration, and by that time, they found a tool which united like-minded people who wanted to speak for their people, who wanted to speak for their for their region, and who wanted to speak against all these brutalities which has been happening over the years. So I have been a political worker since my student life. When we were in student life, highlighting any kind of political activity was a very tough job. But now we have got social media, and we can easily utilize. So all these things, it coincided, like the emergence of the social media, and along with that, the urban middle class of the region, and apart from that, the political education which the people of that area have learned. All these things, it converged at some point, which resulted in the creation of PTM. Initially, it gave some sort of relief to the people, because some missing persons, they were coming back, and the torture was reduced up to some extent, and but it is still going on. Look, the problem is still there. The militants are still there, and they're still grouping. We see, every day people killed in target killings. We have seen people, picked up by the military personnel, and they killed. They died in their custody. So we are still witnessing the same kind of situation and the same kind of attitude from the military, which still, keeps the anxiety of the people alive. And the dynamics might be a bit different from in different regions of Pashtunkhwa, but there is some sort of problem almost everywhere. Right from the Chaman to Swat, there is always some type of, because the Pakistani military, it is now very bluntly behaving like a colonial force, and we have nothing seen changing. So this is, this anxiety and this frustration is keeping the people attached with PTM. Now in the future, I think it depends, because it is a PTM is a reactionary, a kind of reactionary movement, because it emerged as a reaction of all what has been happening in that region. So in future, I think PTM will get organized, and unless and until it forces the Pakistani state to change their policy, I think it is a kind of a monster which they cannot now silence through oppression, which they cannot silence to torture, which they cannot silence to imprisonments. It will keep going on unless and until they force Pakistani state to change their policies.
If I can,
can I just offer a comment?
Sure,
there?
sure. Yeah, please.
I think part of the problem that exists in sending messages to Western countries is twofold. That on the one hand, the Pakistan military is pretty polished in the way in which it presents itself to the wider world. Superficially, people who engage with the Pakistan military, and I'm talking about officials in Australia at staff colleges and things like that, see people who are fluent in English, who have gone to staff college in Quetta, who have a very good understanding of how to pitch themselves to Western audiences as the modernists, as the people who are protecting in Pakistan the kind of values that Western audiences are likely to value. at the same time, there's also in many Western circles a disposition still to see particularly Pashtuns, but non-elite groups within Pakistan and Afghanistan for that matter, through a kind of Orientalist lens, in which the image of Pashtuns is wild, long-haired, tribal customers carrying ancient rifles in their hands and repressing women and all sorts of things like this, very stereotypical. I said to someone the other day that if I went to another conference here on Afghanistan where people began by quoting Kipling, I'd probably run screaming from the room, because A, he never set foot in Afghanistan, and B, the 19th century is a poor guide to the 21st century in virtually any country in the world. In that sense, I think the kind of networking that support groups in Western countries can do to bring the voices of people like Mr. Dawa to bureaucratic audiences in capitals like Berlin and London and Washington is actually very important, because it begins to counter this narrative of a modernist military holding back the hordes of tribalism and that kind of thing that it's surprising to find still prevail in a number of circles. And I go to academic conferences where people say things like Afghanistan is a tribal society, as if there's just one key to understanding a very complex world in which A, large numbers of people are not tribally organized based on lineage, but instead on communities and things like that, and B, the whole notion of tribe as one that in a lot of respects was a product of an Orientalist mindset on the part of colonial powers who were wanting to impose a sense of order on an environment that they couldn't really understand, and they came up with the notion of tribal leaders as a way of going about it. And there's very good work by people like Elizabeth Leake and Nivi Manchanda that's actually brought this out in recent times. So anything that you can do to put in place networks that can be used to dispel these kind of stereotypes can be quite an important contribution.
Well, can I comment?
Yes, sure, please.
Well, I totally agree with Professor Mali, because it has been we always talk that PTM has internationalized the case of Pashtuns, and when we say that it is for a reason, that because it's for the first time that someone has tried to change, because it's all about the perception. Yeah. And if the perception is wrong, so whatever is happening on the ground, it doesn't matter. It is for the first time that we are trying to change the perception, because we have witnessed dozens of people killed on a single day, innocent people. And on the one side, they were killed by the military, and on the other side, they were portrayed as the terrorist. And because it was only their source, it was only them who were building the narrative, and there was no counter narrative against that. So the entire world and the Western bureaucratic circles, they were believing what the Pakistani military was trying to portray. A couple of years ago, I visited the US, and I also visited many think tanks, and I appeared in many dialogues. And the interesting thing was that the Pakistani military, as Professor Mali said, is very much polished, and they have resources, and they have installed their people in the various institutions, the various think tanks of the West. Like one of their members, who is recently been brought back to Pakistan, he is now National Security Advisor of the country. He has been enjoying, he has been working in one of the known think tanks of the US. So this is something, this networking is must needed, and that's why they have put me on the ECL, and letting me go, because on the only visit I had to US, they have it wasn't even a planned political visit. I was there on the international visitors learning program of the State Department. But after I was finished with that, I thought that I should roam around, for a couple of weeks, and I should talk to people and present my case as much as it is possible for me. And the military guys in Pakistan, they were very much pissed off with that, and they put me on ECL, and I'm still on ECL, and they're not letting me go. But now we have too many tools of communication, and even if they want to contain the voices, they cannot. So that is something which is very much needed, and of course we have to build a counter narrative against whatever has been, whatever perception has been of this entire region, and the Pashtunkhwa has been, made by the military. We have to, and up to some extent, the U.S. State Department, they have banned Bravo Anwar. In a few days ago, I heard that even the UK has also banned his entry, and it's all because the advocacy of the PTM, the way PTM has presented its case internationally, it only became possible because the PTM supporters in various countries, they have raised this issue, and there was support from the ground also. There was the first-hand information from the ground also, and PTM supporters all over the world, it presented it in a very better way. And all these things which resulted in banning the entry of Bravo Anwar in the US and the UK. Otherwise, there were thousands of people like Bravo Anwar which have, which have been involved in more severe crimes than what he has done, but nobody knows about it. So, it also, we have to adopt these modern scientific norms to present and strengthen our case internationally.
To our international audiences, ACL means the exit control list,
yes,
which
exit
means
control list that you cannot travel out of the country.
Yes, and almost all of the leadership of PTM is on the ACL. At the same time, Mr. Dawar mentioned Mr. Mueed Yusuf, who's now the senior assistant to Prime Minister Imran Khan, and he had a very senior role in the United States Institute for Peace. And actually, there's a piece by Christine Fair, I guess, who was complaining about Mr. Yusuf's role in USIP. And interestingly, in 2015, I was in an international conference. I was presenting a paper on the Pashtun plight. And then I was talking about how Pashtuns are resisting the China's economic corridor. And Mr. Mueed told me, oh, these are all outliers. They will not, these efforts will not amount to anything. And 3 years down the line, we had PTM, massive resistance against it. So that's another pointer. I know I've taken a lot of time. I'm getting a lot of questions. I'm sorry I cannot pose all the questions. Can I, Mr. Dawar, just ask you, have you spoken to Mr. Wazir recently, or you have no contact with him, with the leader?
Well, after he was presented to the court and he was taken to the nearest police station, I met him, and after that the Sindh police, they came and they said that I met because I'm a member of parliament, otherwise nobody was allowed. So after that he was taken to Islamabad, and today from Islamabad he was he's been moved to Karachi, and hopefully tomorrow he will be presented in the court.
Okay. Are you worried about him?
Well, definitely, but it is such a brutal system that you definitely have to worry about your colleague, and even if he's suspiciously being moved from one place to another, and so everything can happen. So we are definitely worried about him, but our members or people, they are on ground, and I think you might have seen that there was a protest in almost each and every city of then in the entire region, it was almost in every city across the Durand also. Like we have seen protests in Kandahar, in Kabul, in Homs, in many other cities also. So the pressure is also on, but here everything can happen anytime.
Okay, Mr. Mali, you want to?
Yes, one venue for expression of concern about what's happened to Ali Wazir could actually be the international structures that bring parliamentarians together. As Australia, to me, it's actually horrifying to see that a member of the National Assembly could be treated in this particular way. And it could well be a matter where bodies like the Inter-Parliamentary Union or the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, if they were lobbied, might be much more responsive to lobbying than, say, foreign ministries. Which often will see the fate of one individual as subsumed in a wider relationship that they're committed to supporting, whereas MPs across the world tend to be uneasy when they see fellow MPs being arrested, carted off by the military, and things like that. And so it might be worth speaking to some German MPs, members of the Bundestag, to see whether they could raise this particular issue through the Inter-Parliamentary Union. Similarly, support groups in London might want to speak to members of the House of Lords, because since there are a lot of independent members of the House of Lords who are not simply linked to political parties, they may well be disposed to address this. And in fact, Lord Hannay, who is a former senior British diplomat and now a member of the House of Lords, and currently part of the committee that's investigating the situation in Afghanistan and its region, once served as a diplomat in Pakistan and might be worth speaking to as well.
Thank you so much for this. I can see in the list of our audiences, we have members of the PTM's European Coordination Committee. They must take note of this and obviously take action whenever they can. We will play the audio clip of Mr. Dr. Wolf, who was supposed to take part in our webinar today, but unfortunately he lives in Brussels, and Brussels has a curfew beyond 10 o'clock. So we have an audio clip, we'll play that. But before that, Mr. Dawar, Professor Mali, if you have any closing comments, please have them now, and then we will close. Mr. Dawar, you first, please.
Well, I think what I would like to say is seek support of all the international human rights organizations. And I will also request all the PTM supporters living in different countries of the world, that, like the way Professor Mali has said, that they should contact and they should engage with the local MPs and the local human rights organizations, and present, the case and present all these things that have been happening in the entire region. So all these, can build a pressure, and locally here on the ground, we are already working. But this local and international pressure, it can, when it can combinedly, make, some, it can really create some pressure and force the military regime or the people in power here to act, a bit in accordance with the constitution and law of the country, and in accordance with the basic human rights principles, which has been adopted all over the world.
Thank you so much. Before I go to Professor Mali, I'm getting many questions. I'm sorry, we've run out of time. We've already taken up too much of MP Dawar's time and also Professor Mali's time. So Professor Mali, please have your closing remarks, and then we'll go to the audio clip of Dr. Wolf. Thank you so much.
Cool. There's an old saying that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, and this is often deployed by agencies of the state to try to justify intrusive policies of repression. But it also offers a formula which is actually very important for civil society organizations, because in a way, it's often civil society bodies that are most attuned to the threats to liberty that come from the state. And therefore, it's actually very important worldwide to support civil society organizations that pose a challenge to repressive state structures. And in that sense, I think the course that's being pursued by the PTM at the moment is not just an ethnic cause at all. It's a cause which is concerned with human rights values and with a particular image of what a political community should be involved in doing. And in that sense, I think there is a real moral requirement for solidarity with those who are trying to stand up against repressive state power under these circumstances. That sets an agenda of responsibility for Western countries as well as just actors who might be on the ground in Pakistan.
Thank you so much. My colleagues will now play the audio clip from Dr. Wolf. Mr. Dawar, Professor Mali, it's been a real pleasure, and we wish Mr. Ali all the best. And obviously, I think we all know that there are many people that are worried about him, but at the same time, they're not going to sit tight and not do anything about it. So they are taking actions, and this webinar was part of a very small part of that effort. If you'd like to stay on to listen to the audio clip, which I think really sums up the discussion we've had, you're welcome to stay on. If not, again, thank you so much for your time, and bye from me.
Thank you so much.
Dear Chair, dear panelists and online auditorium, on last Wednesday, December 16, Member of National Assembly Ali Wazir and the leader of the Pashtun Protection Movement got arrested. He has been accused of committing several offenses, including hatching a criminal conspiracy and passing derogatory remarks against state institutions, particularly against the army and paramilitary forces. Regarding the chairman of the Pakistan People's Party and leader of the opposition, Bilawal Bhutto, the arrest is baseless, against democratic traditions, and a fascist tool to muzzle the freedom of expression. It is important to highlight that Wazir got arrested after attending a ceremony held at Shuhada APS Public Library in connection with the 6th anniversary of the Army Public School attack, where 147 people were killed by the Taliban. This is gaining significance since at the same time a Taliban delegation arrived in Islamabad to discuss the current developments in Afghanistan, particularly in the context of the US withdrawal and the talks between Taliban and Afghan government. It is obvious that the arrest of Mr. Wazir is part of a campaign to silence critical voices on Pakistan's sponsorship of the Taliban. Regarding experts, it seems that Pakistan's army and intelligence service ISI is losing its grip over a faction of the Taliban and spending much efforts in regaining and or maintaining its influence over this militant jihadist movement. Following the logic of Pakistan's security establishment, the arrest of Wazir is a measure to hush up the PTM, questioning the dubious connection between Pakistan's authorities and the terrorist organizations like the Taliban, particularly the Haqqani network. Here it is important to understand, especially for our audience outside Pakistan, who might be not so familiar with the political dynamics in the country, that the PTM is a peaceful socio-political movement which is facing a double threat from regional and international terrorists on one side and from the federal government and its security sector agents on the other. Led by liberal and secular politicians and activists, the civic grassroots initiative PTM gained much popularity in the northwest of Pakistan during the last few years and translated the human suffering incurred by the Pashtuns into a national discourse with growing international significance. Today, the PTM is one of the most powerful human rights voices in Pakistan, being the target of numerous heavily armed campaigns by both the Pakistani army and by militant groups. Areas of Pashtun settlements are largely destroyed, livelihoods have been spoiled, and millions of people were or are still displaced. In criticizing the violent excesses by the military, the Pashtun became the target focus of Pakistan's authorities, which have declared them and the demands to be anti-national. Subsequently, Pashtuns witnessed repressive measures such as extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, discrimination and surveillance by the country's security forces. The violent suppression of the Pashtun people must be seen as part of Pakistan's larger strategy of using state terrorism not only against its neighbors, foremost India and Afghanistan, but also against own citizens and people living in disputed territories occupied by Pakistan. Reporting on the PTM is censored, especially in what concerns the huge rallies the movement holds. In contrast, the government grants hardline Islamists an increasing public space to spread the ideology of hate against the country's neighbors as well as Western states, and propagate humiliation and violence against religious ethnic minorities within its borders. Political mainstreaming of jihadi terror groups and their leaders, allowing them to form parties and join election, constitute official policy in Pakistan. However, the PTM must face severe attempts of political marginalization by the authorities. Non-violent protests by the Pashtuns are dissolved by the security agencies using disproportionate coercive force. It is reported that Pakistan's armed forces opened fire on unarmed demonstrators, killing numerous Pashtun activists and supporters. Moreover, there's a clear evidence that the military, police, and ISI are kidnapping PTM leaders on a regular basis and are involved in extrajudicial killings like the assassination of Arif Wasir, a relative of latest arrested Ali Wasir. In sum, the ongoing suppression of Pashtuns and its non-violent PTM is a clear indication that Pakistan continues to use state terrorism and the domestic front, meaning against its own citizens and peoples under its administration. Furthermore, one must expect that Pakistan will maintain instruments of state-sponsored terrorism in its foreign policy, particularly in its support for cross-border terrorism. Here, the arrest of Ali Wasir must be seen as an indicator that the collaboration between the Taliban to destabilize Afghanistan is of more importance for Pakistan's authorities than democracy, human and fundamental political rights, and respect for its own people.
Seem to have encountered a technical issue, but anyhow, I think we can end it here. Once again, I'd like to thank my really distinguished panelists, Mr. Dawar and Professor William Mawley. It was a pleasure having you. I wish you all a good night, particularly Mr. Dawar. It's 2 a.m. in Pakistan, 3 a.m. now.
Yes.
Thank you so much for your time.
Take
care. Bye.
Thank you, Malays. Thank you very much.
Thank you, man.
Take care.
Thank you, man.